I'm going to experiment today with another bread recipe, and I say another because last week I experimented with one. Someone sent me a link to a bread recipe online, absolutely beautiful loaf of bread. It won a contest. Beautiful. I made it, I videoed it, I tasted it. It was disgusting. Oh, it was awful. I had to throw it in the trash. I thought I can do better than this. I want bread that tastes like bread. I don't want to miss the taste of the bread because there's all this junk that's in it. I'm going to make what I'm going to call it cheese bread, but it's going to be mostly bread. The cheese is going to be on the outside. There isn't going to be a lot of cheese inside. And what I'm going to do that's different is I'm going to work with a formula from one of Wayne Gisslen's books. This is Professional Baking. This is the 5th edition. I think the 7th edition is out. It's a bit expensive. I think it's $125 about on Amazon. Anyways, I'm going to use one of his formulas because I've been baking bread for years. I've made hundreds of loaves of bread, and I have a formula that I like. It's actually comes from one of Julia Child's recipes. It works. He does everything metrically, and the professional chefs do that. They even weigh the water because it's a lot easier to multiply things up. So one loaf of bread, you're using 500 grams of flour, 300 grams of water. If you want to make 10 loaves of bread, 5,000 grams of flour, or 5 kilos, etc. It's a lot easier when you have metric numbers rather than how do you multiply up 2 3/4 of this, 1 1/3 of that, teaspoon, and so forth. So anyways, I'm going to use one of his formulas to do the basic bread, but then I'm going to coat the outside. I'm going to brush it with an egg wash, just using the egg white. The yolk's going to go in the bread. And then I'm going to garnish the outside with some Romano cheese and a little bit of prosciutto that I fried this morning till it was crisp and then chopped it up. I think it'll make a nicely flavored loaf of bread. So let's make this cheese bread. Okay, just to explain one thing. He has 2 formulas. One is imperial and the other is in metric. They're not exactly equivalent, but they're close. You follow either one or the other. You don't mix up the parts. So what I've got here is 200 grams of water. This happens to be at room temperature, or you can use 8 fluid ounces, which would be about 1 cup, or would be 1 cup. And then I have 100 grams of milk. This is also at room temperature. He uses milk powder with more water. I thought, why not just use milk? That's 100 grams of milk, or 4 fluid ounces, 1/2 cup. Now, to explain the yeast, his formula uses either fresh yeast, which would be 18 grams, or 3/4 ounces, or 2 tablespoons, roughly, of fresh cake yeast, baker's yeast. I'm going to use active dry yeast, which is 6 grams, or 2 teaspoons. And then finally, I've got to put my sugar in there, which is my sugar. I have sugar and I have salt. This is the sugar. This is 18 grams, 3/4 ounce, 4 teaspoons of sugar. And then I'm going to let that just dissolve in there, and that'll get my yeast activated. It'll take about 3 or 4 minutes. While I was waiting for my yeast to do its thing, I separated an egg. This was a large egg in the shell. It weighed 60 grams. I'm going to set aside the egg white because that's what I'm going to use for the egg wash. I might as well use the yolk. So I'm going to put that in the liquid for the dough, and I'm going to mix all this up. Gives me a chance to use my dough mixer. This was sent to me by a fan of the website. She's from Italy. I get gifts sometimes. All right, that mixes that up. And then what I have is 500 grams, or you can use 1 pound, 4 ounces, or 4 cups. If you're measuring by 4 cups, they should be about 5 ounces each. I'm going to start mixing in my flour, but not all at once. I'm always concerned about the formula. I know what I'm looking for as far as a mixture. I'm going to put most of this in there, and then I'm going to move my bowl to the stand mixer and then start working in the remainder of the flour. I'm also going to add my salt. So I have 12 grams or 1/2 ounce, 2 teaspoons of salt. And the flour, by the way, that I'm using is bread flour. But supposedly you can use all-purpose flour and it'll work just about equally as well. Bread flour has a little bit more protein in it, which helps it to build up the gluten chains, which gives bread the bubbles and its airiness and helps it to rise. Okay, I'm going to move this to my stand mixer. So I set my bowl on my stand mixer, I put my dough hook in there, and what I'm going to do is start working my flour in. What I always look for, and it's hard to explain it, hard to show it, but I want to see the dough pulling away from the side of the bowl once it's fully kneaded and mixed well, but still sticking a little bit in the bottom of the bowl. I look for that. If I find that set up, then it gives me the texture of bread that I most like. Okay, so I'm going to move my bowl up, set it at number 2, and start working in flour. I stopped my mixer because I'm going to start scraping down the side of the bowl. This is starting to come together into a dough. I haven't used all my flour yet, but I want to make sure I incorporate everything that's in the bowl. So get things scraped down and then keep going. Okay, so I'm not seeing the kind of sticking that I would like to see. There's a little bit of sticking, but to be honest, the dough doesn't feel moist enough, and that makes sense because the ratio that I work with Julia Child's recipe is about 65%, which would mean for 500 grams of flour, I would have about 325 grams of liquid. However, I have to work in the fat yet, and that's going to add a little bit of more moisture. What I have here is 3/4 of an ounce or 18 grams, 4 teaspoons of butter. This is whole butter. Butter is 80% fat and milk solids, 80% butter fat and 20% water and milk solids here in the United States. So as I said, that's going to add a little bit more moisture. When you work in butter, the dough is going to break up because of the butter. But you just keep working it, that butter will eventually incorporate and the dough will come back together again. Okay, this still isn't quite where I want it yet, but there's my dough ball. You can see that it came back together again. It's not sticking in the bottom. So now what I'm going to do, and I still have maybe 2 to 3 tablespoons of flour left. This is where I call bread making more of an art than a science. You know what to look for. I know what I want to see as far as sticking in the bowl, so I'm going to start adding maybe a teaspoon of water. Things vary. Flour varies year-round. Sometimes it'll absorb more moisture, sometimes less. Things vary. So I'm ready to start adjusting now. I almost always adjust. Either I add more flour or I add more liquid. I'm going to try to show you this if I can. It's sticking in the bottom. It's pulling away from the side of the bowl. It looks sort of like this if you can see it on the video. So it's pulling away, but it's sticking in the bottom. That to me is perfect. That's the recipe, the formula that I like. What I added to that was 2 teaspoons of water. So there is my bread dough. Now, once you start making bread and get used to it, you'll know the feel of it. It's not sticking to my hands, but it is sticky. See, that to me is the ideal, that if I work it fast enough, it's not sticking to the counter, it's not sticking to my hands, but if I squeeze that, it will stick. It's moist, it's a little bit sticky. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to clean this bowl out, and I'm going to use this bowl for the rising. And by the way, I did this in my machine, but you could do this by hand. Bread has been made by hand for thousands of years. You don't need a stand mixer. So I buttered my bowl really well. I'm going to put my dough in there. Then I'm going to butter the top of the dough with this plastic bag that I used. And then you can either cover this with plastic. One person told me he uses a shower cap to cover his bowl. I have some of these. This is a silicone lid. They actually fit so well. If I take the air out, I can actually lift the bowl up with the lid. I'm not going to leave it that way. I just want to keep in the moisture. Set this in a warm place to rise. My favorite place is to put this on top of my computer. I get really good results from that. And this is going to take about an hour to rise. I want to see it doubled in bulk. Depending upon how warm or cool your kitchen, it could take longer. If you want to really enhance the flavor of the bread dough, you could put this in the refrigerator and let it rise overnight and then bake the bread the next day. I'm also going to put a little bit of prosciutto on the outside. This is prosciutto di Parma, product of Italy. I'm just going to use one slice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fry this in a skillet until it's crisp. I've got one slice there. Now I've got two. Okay, one slice. And just fry it until it's crisp. It's okay if it tears a little bit because I'm going to chop that up anyways. And then once it's fried and crisp, then I'll chop it up. Here is my dough, nicely risen. After about an hour, I'm going to punch that down. You're going to hear saw sounds outside. They're working on the trees outside. What I'm doing is I'm kind of rolling this dough into itself, pushing it into the bottom because I want to get that buttery surface in there. Because at this service, I'm going to put an egg wash on. And I'm doing this on a piece of parchment paper. The reason for which will be obvious in a moment. I want to shape this kind of high if I can. Okay. Here is my egg wash. That's the white from that egg. And I put maybe 2 or 3 teaspoons of water in there. I'm going to paint the outside of this. Ugh, that noise outside. It was construction for a while. Now they're doing tree trimming. And then what I have here is some shredded cheese. This is Romano. You can use Parmesan. You could even use sharp cheddar. That would be good on this bread. This is 18 grams, which is about 3/4 of an ounce, or by volume, about 1/4 cup. And then this is that prosciutto, one slice that I've fried up. That came in at about 7 grams, 1/4 of an ounce. Just going to mix those two up. And then I'm going to sprinkle this on the bread. Oh, I can smell that. That smells so good. Get that all the way around the outside. Put the last of that on there. Make sure that it's patted in everywhere. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm lifting this up carefully because I'm going to try something different. I'm going to use a vertical springform pan that I lined with parchment. And before I put that dough in there, and this is the why I use this parchment, I'm just going to sprinkle the excess in the bottom. distribute that around, and then put my dough down inside. It's a little bit messy, but should be okay. Make sure my parchment is distributed evenly. Then I'm going to cover this lightly with plastic. Might as well put that on top. And then let this rise for another 45 minutes to an hour. So there's my loaf in there. The reason why I'm using this pan is because I want to see what it's like if I make a more vertical loaf. You could put that bread in a regular bread pan. That would be fine. Now to let this rise, I'm just going to cover this very lightly with plastic wrap, leaving room at the top. Okay, this has been rising, as you can see. I have in the meantime heated my oven to about 175 degrees Celsius. That's around 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I normally bake bread at a higher temperature, but I don't want things to brown too much. I am estimating, because of the shape of this loaf, that it's going to take longer than usual for this to bake. So I'm going to say 40 to 50 minutes. If you do this in a regular bread pan or put it on a baking sheet, maybe 30 to 40 minutes would be all that was necessary. Here is my bread out of the oven. So far, so good. I'm going to let this cool in the pan for about 5 minutes, and then I will remove that from that springform pan. All right, let me see if I can get this out of the pan without too much difficulty. No difficulty at all. Look at that. Okay, take my... Oh, look at how beautifully brown that is. Oh, that it looks wonderful. I know how hot that is, but I want to get that off that bottom pan. So, working really quickly. Ta-da! There it is. Okay. That bottom pan is hot. All right, I'm going to let that cool completely and then cut it open. See what it looks like inside. This is cooled down thoroughly now. I can cut this. I want to see what it looks like inside. I'm going to cut right down through the middle. Feels tender inside. There it is. Look at that beautiful bread. And the reason why I would cut it down the middle is if I were going to be serving this, I would cut this in wedges like you would a panettone. You don't have to make it in the pan that I did, but you could if you wanted to. That makes a beautiful loaf of bread. All right, last step is to put some butter on a slice of this and see what it tastes like. Okay. I cut a wedge for myself. Put a little bit of butter on it. I want to taste this so badly. This is the second time I've made this because the first time was a total failure. Oh, yeah. See, I mean, the crumb is, the white part is just so tender, but it's a little bit of crunch from that fried prosciutto. And of course, the cheese on the outside is just a nice extra flavor. This is a really good bread. Oh, that is good. That is a really nice bread. Okay. Excuse me. I'm going to go enjoy my afternoon snack of cheese bread.